Welcome. My name's Diane Yu, Deputy President of NYU, and I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's program, Is Engagement Dead? The U.S. After 2012, which I think you will find to be a fascinating exploration of contemporary American foreign policy. On behalf of the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute, I'm also pleased to welcome you because many of you know that the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute is famous over the last 4 years for having brought over 100 programs, lectures, performances, and conferences to this community in an effort to promote intellectual awareness, discussion, debate, and to bring some extraordinary artists and performers to this region. Tonight, your featured speaker is James Traub. He's a frequent author and commentator on foreign policy issues. He's a graduate of Harvard University and currently has a weekly column, Terms of Engagement, which provides in foreignpolicy.com, its web organization for Foreign Policy magazine. He's a freelance journalist who's contributed insightful articles in all the major prominent publications, including The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, The New York Review of Books, The Atlantic Monthly, National Review, and Foreign Affairs. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a fellow of the Center on International Cooperation and a senior fellow of the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect Against Atrocities. His many books include The Freedom Agenda, Why America Must Spread Democracy, Just Not the Way George Bush Did It, and also a noteworthy book on the best intentions, Kofi Annan and the UN in the era of American world power. He's someone who also has come to Abu Dhabi on a regular basis since 2009, which is when I first met him because he became an instructor in the Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Scholars Program, teaching a course on US foreign policy to a group of very talented students here in the Emirates who attend either the United Arab Emirates University, Zayed University, or higher colleges of technology. He's an extraordinary lecturer. You will find tonight that his insights, his provocative comments and thoughts, and his extraordinary ability to articulate some of the most complex issues will truly be a treasure for you. And tonight, his interlocutor is Professor Jules Coleman, who's a senior vice provost at NYU. He's also a professor of philosophy at NYU Abu Dhabi and New York University in New York. He's actually been affiliated with NYU for more than 10 years, while he was, at the time, a noted professor of philosophy and law at Yale University. He's one of the most respected and renowned philosophers and legal theorists around, and his many, many writings, including the book Rights and Wrongs, which just passed its 20th anniversary, and The Practice of Principle, have been the subject of numerous conferences around the world by major scholars. He's previously taught at the University of California, the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and the University of Arizona. He's a delightful person. I've gotten to know him for over the last 10 years. We often go to lunch, and I found them always to be enormously interesting because he has such a wide range of interests, very provocative, and often very expensive lunches. But he's a terrific person. I think he'll be a wonderful interlocutor. He's a graduate of Rockefeller University, where he got his PhD, Yale, where he got his law degree, and Brooklyn College, his alma mater. So it's a terrific program tonight. We hope you have many, many questions. Jules will begin by asking a number of pointed questions to Jim, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So please welcome Jim Traub and Jules Coleman.
So I thought what we would do would be the following. I would ask some general questions first about U.S. foreign policy and the presidency, and then move into more particular questions about Obama's foreign policy in the past 4 years and into what's to be expected in the future. We will carry on this conversation for the first segment of the evening, and then open it up to questions from the audience. So Jim, if I may, I'd like to begin by asking a question the general sort, which is, in the modern era, what kind of influence do you think a president of the United States can actually have in shaping the core values rather than just at the margin of foreign policy, more generally?
All right, well, thanks. And I just want to say I'm so delighted to be here, and especially to have the great Jules Coleman as my interlocutor. Jules is about to go to have the possibly third Festschrift of his career next week, so that gives you an idea of the standing of this man. So it's a great question because Obama is possibly a kind of laboratory test of the question that Jules just asked. And I say this for the following reason, that Obama campaigned to an extent we hardly remember now, at least in the early part of the campaign, on his promise to transform American foreign policy by transforming the way America was seen in the world. That is, we all remember the sense of tremendous damage that George Bush did to America's reputation in the world, both through the invasion of Iraq and through his bellicose rhetoric, his unilateralism, and so on. And so before the economic crisis began in early 2008, Obama's campaign was really about foreign policy more than anything else. And I wrote an article about him for the New York Times Magazine in the late summer, early fall of 2007. And the reason for my article was to say, does this man have a world view? Now, most presidential candidates don't have a world view. They don't usually know much about the world. George Bush had never been to a foreign country, except he went to China, I think, once. Barack Obama, of course, had lived as a young person in a foreign country, in Indonesia. And of course, he had a father who was Kenyan. And so, first of all, what I found in the course of writing the article was that, yes, the guy had a coherent worldview, which I was quite struck by, besides the fact that I really liked his worldview. And it consisted in no small part of the fact that he had a sensitivity to how America's power felt on the receiving end that came from who he was. He had an awareness of America's role in the world that just came from being a highly thoughtful, intellectually very attuned person. But he did not have the kind of intuitive discomfort with American power that an older generation would have had. That is, people whose views were shaped by the war in Vietnam. He, of course, was a little boy then. And so, though I say he had this awareness of how America could behave in the world and how America was seen in the world and all the negative elements of that, there was also a tremendously powerful element that he had seen that America could be a great force for good, and he didn't have, as I say, this sense of restraint or embarrassment about American power. It was an unusual combination. And he promised this tremendous sense of renewal, and that took lots of forms. He was going to conduct the war on terror in a profoundly different way. He was going to take issues like foreign aid much more seriously than Bush had. He was, of course, going to close down as quickly as possible the war in Iraq. He was going to focus on the renewal of international institutions, which Bush had had a very low regard for. He was going to take very seriously global issues like non-proliferation, climate change, and so forth. So the going-in sense was, yes, it is possible and necessary for this individual to deeply change American foreign policy. Now, as a laboratory case, you could conclude that he pushed hard and found that this thing was actually had a lot more internal tension to it than he thought, and so it pushed back. And so the amount that Obama has changed American foreign policy, which is significant, is not much compared to what he thought he would do and what his supporters thought he would do. And there are a bunch of reasons for that. One is that America has national interest, that every nation, of course, has national interest, but America's come from its unique situation as the global power. And so America is concerned about something that happens everywhere. America feels vulnerable in events everywhere. America is expected to lead in all sorts of endeavors. For example, the question of whether or not the U.S. would intervene in Libya or whether it will intervene in Syria. The threats posed by terrorism. So if you look at places where Obama hasn't changed foreign policy nearly as much as people thought he would, an obvious case would be the war on terror. And so here's Obama using drone strikes far more than Bush ever did, though I imagine if a Bush or a Bush-like president was there today, he'd be doing the same thing. Obama said he would close down Guantanamo. He hasn't. The general sense that Obama would turn the war on terror into something more like a set of police actions, that it would be less militarized, that hasn't been borne out at all. Then there are other cases where Obama hasn't done what he hoped to do, not because it's impossible for a president to reshape American foreign policy, but because there are other kinds of limitations on a president, for example, the power of the Congress. So, Obama wanted to make nuclear nonproliferation a centerpiece of his time in office. And the first really big speech he gave before the famous speech in Cairo was a speech he gave in Prague in April of 2009, where he called for the first time to eliminate nuclear weapons. Not right away, of course, but over time, to move towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. Well, he thought the plan was that first he would reach an arms treaty with the Russians. Then he would move from there to a series of other moves, including other treaties, a so-called fissile material cutoff treaty, a nuclear test ban treaty, and so forth. Well, he did do the first thing. He worked with the Russians and reached an agreement to seriously reduce nuclear arms. The Senate then spent months and months and months and months and months haggling over a treaty that was obviously in America's favor, but the Republicans didn't want to give him the benefit of passing it. Finally, he did. Well, at that point, by that time, it became clear that the other things he hoped to do, these other treaties, for example, they just weren't going to happen. It wasn't even worth trying. And so on this and on other issues, climate change, for example, development assistance, he hasn't been able to do what he wanted to do because of the Congress hedging him in. So I would say overall his lesson has been that it is harder. There was less capacity for a president to transform this thing than he thought there was going in.
And do you think that that's the wave of the future, that presidents will make efforts to make change, but it'll be more and more difficult for the set of internal and external constraints?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think one thing I didn't add is that there's a story about a British prime minister, I think it was Macmillan, when somebody reproached him for why his policy had strayed so far from what he had said it would be. And his answer was, events, dear boy, events. And foreign policy is different from domestic policy this way. Domestic policy, you have this agenda. I'm going to do this, 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 this. And then you work like hell to get the Congress to buy part of it, all of it, a piece of it, trade this, do that, and so forth. And you come out with something or other. Foreign policy, you may have a program, as Obama very much did, but then you find so much of what you do is dictated by unexpected events. And so Afghanistan almost swallowed Obama's foreign policy whole. He never thought this would be the case. And so when he first came into office, he realized Afghanistan was a mess. He had to do something. He had a series of meetings. He produced a plan in March. We're going to send more troops, do this and that, deal with the problem. Well, didn't deal with the problem. And then in June, he realized he hadn't dealt with the problem. And then he spent 4 months trying to come up with a better plan. And as we all know, Afghanistan has been a kind of quicksand. So the first thing I would say is that whether or not this is a trend, foreign policy by its nature is more difficult to attain a mastery of than domestic policy. Whether there's something in the nature of things now that means there won't be so much latitude? It's a good question. I mean, here's a hypothetical that I think about, but lots of people think about. What if Bush v. Gore, the Supreme Court decision, had gone the other way, and Al Gore had been elected president in 2000? And so when 9/11 happened, it wasn't President George Bush, it was President Al Gore. So this is a different kind of laboratory experiment. This is a hypothetical one. And I think maybe I'm going to contradict myself here. It's in part because George Bush's foreign policy was so exceptional. And I mean that negatively, but just in the mathematical sense. It was a big way away from the median. And so there's a case where there would have been a big difference. Al Gore would not have invaded Iraq. And everything that comes from the invasion of Iraq wouldn't have happened. So I don't know if there is something in the nature of events now that more limits a president's latitude. If there is any such thing, it's probably because America lives in a world in which it is less able to exercise power than it was before, because America obviously is not the supreme hegemon that it was in the 1990s, much less after World War II. And so any American president is going to be more hemmed in by not rival powers, other power centers, than he would have been a generation or two ago.
So in a way, if I were to ask you what are the drivers of a foreign policy, it's a kind of responsiveness to events and the strategic nature of interaction of America to everything else that's going on in the world. It's very hard to have a foreign policy agenda with a set of goals and principles and ideals. You can articulate it, but the form in which it gets expressed is very sensitive to changes in events.
But not hopelessly so. So if you think about this famous pivot to Asia that Obama and the Obama administration talk about all the time, to me, a part of it is precisely not wanting to be trapped by events and by the consuming worries about terrorism and national security. So Obama came into office with an agenda, with principles, with a plan, with a worldview. And so much of that got eaten up by Afghanistan and the war on terror. And I'm sure he was yearning all the time to close that down, to close down Afghanistan, to close down Iraq so I can finally do what I want to do, meaning nonproliferation and climate change, and above all, dealing with all the issues that don't have to do with conflict. So Asia is preeminently the place which is not about conflict, but about growth. It's about good things happening. And so Afghanistan, Iraq, the war on terror, they're of course about preventing terrible things from happening. And Obama had this forward-looking visionary agenda. That's part of his nature, which he found himself unable to execute as much as he thought. And so pivoting to Asia it's like a kind of transcendent vacation from the agony of and frustration of the Middle East. So there, and I don't think when he was campaigning in 2008, he wasn't talking about Asia. It's not as if that was what he was always yearning for. It's much more the wish for a positive agenda that will promote America's economic growth and its alliances in an area which is very stable and increasingly democratic. There's obviously a big conflict issue there because of China's growing aggressiveness in the South China Seas, and so conflicts over all these islands and so forth. But a big part of it also is to get untrammeled from all the stuff that has trammeled him so forth. So maybe, I suppose one way of expressing it is that his second term, if he's fortunate, will be less governed by trying to deal with impossible situations, and therefore will give him more latitude to do what he wishes to do.
Well, that's very helpful. It's kind of makes me want to ask two different kinds of questions. The first has to do with the fact that he was driven during the presidential campaign to refer to China as an adversary and to use the same sort of discourse of ways of conceptualizing even what was supposed to be a very different kind of foreign policy. So do you really think that there really is hope in that regard, that this is about where there'll be opportunities for growth? I mean, it's starting out on the wrong foot with conceptualizing China as an adversary.
You know, every president starts off by saying, I am going to get tough on China. And then they realize you can't afford to get tough on China. And so then they wind up being nice to China. Now, Obama has undergone, actually, oddly enough, the opposite trajectory, which is when Hillary Clinton first went to China in 2009, she famously said something that was understood as, we're concerned about human rights, but we're going to put them to one side so that we can focus on the task at hand. Now, she would say, that's not what I meant, but that's sure what it sounded like. There was a real attempt on Obama's part of his policy of engagement, that is to say, to have thickened relations with lots of countries with which our relations had become either thin or frictional, was to say to China, look, we don't want to have this fight. We do not accept your human rights views, but we have lots of business to transact, global issues, bilateral issues, regional issues, and so forth. So that was the approach. Obama discovered he got nothing for it. I mean, this was a kind of interesting lesson on this question of engagement. I mean, we can talk about this in terms of some other issues as well. So first Hillary Clinton goes, and then Obama himself has the celebrated visit, and he's treated really shabbily by his hosts. He's prevented from speaking. A speech he's giving to students, which was supposed to be broadcast, is not broadcast. He's treated in a rather slighting way, and these hopes that he'll get some policy changes. He wanted the Chinese to agree to slightly increase the value of their currency. Nothing. So I would say there was kind of a 2-year period or so where they tried engagement. Didn't work. Didn't work very well anyway. And so the administration's tone on China actually got tougher and harsher towards the end. And it's true that as part of the pivot to Asia, Obama and Secretary Clinton made it fairly clear that they would not accept and would actively contest China's claims to these islands in the South China Seas. That got China really upset, but that's okay because it turns out Obama wasn't getting what he thought he would get by being nice. Now, is China going to take it amiss that Obama said that they're an adversary? No, that's just politics. So what matters is what they do. But I do think that it's not that the relationship will be bad because Obama said this thing, though he did say it for purely political reasons. It's just every China bashing is the lowest common denominator of American politics now. No, it'll be bad. It'll be bad. It will be frictional because Obama has concluded, well, let's put it this way. Obama had concluded that China was in a position where its nationalism, its growing power, was driving it away from the idea of seeking common ground. Now, what will happen with the new Chinese regime? We don't know, and presumably there will be a waiting period when we see how they choose to react. It isn't just the regime, it's also the Chinese military. There was the feeling before the Chinese military was really driving foreign policy, or it wasn't really clear if it was one foreign policy or two foreign policies. So all that remains to be seen, but I think certainly this is one of those cases where the kind of bloom is off the rose.
Well, you know what's interesting is there were so many high expectations here in the Middle East with Obama's presidency, his victory in 2008, and now we have a switch in policy in 2012 to an emphasis on Asia. And so that invites a series of questions and concerns having to do with whether the Middle East will be abandoned by Obama, whether he can abandon it, and what exactly have his achievements been in the Middle East over the first 4 years. So let's think of this in terms of two different kinds of questions. One having to do with what were the achievements, what did engagement consist in, was most of it a methodology and very little of it substantive change in policy? Were there any real great successes? And what can we anticipate in the future over the next 4 years?
Well, Jules, those are like 9 questions.
Well, it's like 9, but I think of them as 2.
Okay. It's like A sub 1, 2, 3, B sub 1, small b, C. Okay.
Well, take your time.
Okay, I'll take, yeah, exactly. So, what were his achievements in the Middle East? One big, though contested one, is the intervention in Libya. So, I say contested because we don't know how it's going to wind up. And of course, you never know. When you act in this interventionist way, you never know the outcome. And that's one reason why Obama hesitated a long time before doing it. It's why he has chosen not to act in Syria. Obama knows very well that things don't turn out as you wish them to turn out. He is, in this sense, a prudent, and I would even say a wise person. And it very much works against this kind of visionary streak in him. The visionary streak is real, but the prudential thing is also very real. That's his temperament. I think people didn't really know that about him when they voted for him. And maybe part of the disappointment is, oh, I hadn't realized he was so cautious. So, in the case of the Middle East, the Cairo speech is a sort of great example of both the hopes and the disappointments. I mean, the Cairo speech was a fantastic speech. It was a great, great speech. But it was a speech. And I think Obama himself and his team were too inclined to believe that a speech was an act. And that by giving a speech that was a beautiful speech and saying things that had not been said before, you had actually done something. You had changed something. And you do, but it's very transitory. So public opinion polls in the Middle East found that Obama was more popular and America was more popular by quite a distance than had been the case under George Bush. But then they went back down because it was just a speech. And so Obama felt that by speaking honestly and by saying we must speak honestly to each other, and by summoning people to their better angels, and by saying America had done wrong in some ways, and by saying that we must each admit our failures to one another, it would somehow place relations between the United States and the Arab world in a different footing. Well, that's all very nice, but you can't buy lunch with it. So where was the change in policy towards Middle East peace? Well, there wasn't one. There was a policy, but it failed. Where was the willingness to stand up against autocrats in the Arab world? Well, there was nice language about democracy. It was sincere language. But there was no sign of willingness to say to, for example, his host at that time, of course, President Mubarak, you cannot treat people this way. And so, what was the bottom line? There actually are passages in the speech where he says we're going to increase business and science and entrepreneurial engagements and have a summit meeting about this stuff. But that was all small potatoes. And so it exposed, I think, one of the fallacies that Obama has suffered from, which is that that speech is important, but when you're running for office, speech is an act because it gets you elected. That's the goal. When you're governing, it doesn't. So, for the first couple of years, you would have said nothing. An attempt to revive the peace process, which failed, and by the end of 2010 was essentially declared dead. Then comes the Arab Spring. And so one of the fundamental truths about that was that America had spoken in the past about the need to bring democracy to the Middle East and had done certain small things, but it didn't matter. And it never would matter. What would matter was what the Arab peoples did for themselves. And nobody could seriously claim that what happened in the Arab world in 2011 had anything to do with the United States. I mean, Bush people like to say that somehow they had broken everything open by virtue of the war in Iraq. Well, yes, they had broken a lot of things. They had broken
everything, yes.
They had broken things. So that happened without the United States, which Obama fully recognized. Libya was obviously a big decision. And it's telling about Obama that he was very reluctant, not because he didn't recognize the moral urgency of acting to prevent what looked like atrocities that Gaddafi was going to commit in Benghazi if he simply marched in against a civilian, unarmed civilian population, but because he was acutely aware that things could go wrong. When he was convinced that the balance of the argument was to act, he acted. In the military sense, of course, it was a tremendous success. It took much longer than people thought, but it succeeded not only in preventing those atrocities, but in deposing Gaddafi. Now, Libya right now is in a very, very parlous situation. There are things that are actually quite encouraging. And Libyan people are clearly, they were enthralled with the election they held a few months ago. There's a deep sense of hope and possibility, but also tremendous anxiety about whether militias will ultimately get the upper hand and Libya will fall into chaos. And if that happened, it will not look like a success at all. But that's clearly his one big success. I would say another thing of somewhat lesser importance, but by no means insignificant, is the role that Obama played in the fall of Mubarak. There, too, he acted later than people wanted him to. I would say that would be the kind of hallmark of Obama's role throughout the Arab Spring, is a wish to act, but a real sense of caution about acting. But he did ultimately say to Mubarak, your time has come, you have to go. And so, given the influence that the US has, especially the American military and intelligence apparatus had with the Egyptian military and intelligence apparatus, that mattered. So I would say that's like I give him a half credit. Not because he only did half the right thing, but only half mattered. So those would be the achievements. But I want to leave the engagement question a little bit to the side, because we should talk about that, but for other things as well. The future question is the pivot to Asia, a pivot away from the Middle East. Obama's in this situation now where he's actually said, I like one of my children more than the others, and so all the other children are really upset. So he has to, for example, keep saying to the Europeans, well, I didn't mean I'm pivoting away from you. He's not pivoting away from anybody. Now, of course he is. You can't. He only has 100% of his time, energy, money, and so if he's going to spend more somewhere, he's going to spend less somewhere else. Now, I think the honest answer to that, though, is that what he means is we are drawing down in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I'm pivoting away from that world of bloodshed. He wants to be and will be very much engaged with the newly democratizing states of the Arab world. Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Yemen, which is a special case because it's kind of half about the war on terror and half about the Arab Spring. And there will be a lot of diplomatic and political engagement, some economic engagement, not a lot because America's tapped out right now. So I don't think that's going to go away. I just think that so much of what's happening in the Arab world, outsiders just can't really alter. It's a profound moment in history with deep internal contradictions. We just don't know how it's going to work out. So to some extent, we are deeply hopeful spectators of that.
Do you think it's more promising in the Middle East than it has been before in the recent past?
Yeah.
Because of the democratization?
I do. I mean, now, maybe it's my temperament. I'm just an optimist. And so I just think, good. And I'm an American, so I think democracy, good. Since none of us know, you can't know, I think the question is, in the long run, it will be good, but of course, in the long run, we'll all be dead, so how long is the long run? Egypt is obviously a really hard question right now, and the events of the last week, when President Morsi, the last several weeks, when President Morsi delivered this decree, which essentially made him a new autocratic leader of Egypt, and at the same time, the secular forces have shown themselves as distrustful of democratic rule in many ways as Morsi has. The complete unwillingness to accept a constitution which clearly represents the majority will of Egypt, because the majority will of Egypt is mostly not secular. There are no parties there that have shown a lot of faith in democracy, because it's something people haven't lived with before. And you naturally, at moments of fear, you revert to what you know. And so you go out into the street, you call for the downfall of the regime. It's a really bad moment. Now, I think the only good thing is Morsi has been forced to step back in a way that Mubarak never could have been, because the forces of popular will have been unleashed. And so you feel like at least there is the hope that there now are these internal checks and balances, not in the sense of political institutions, in the sense of public opinion. And so you just have to hope that this doesn't turn into a train wreck. And I don't know. As I say, I still feel on balance the Egyptians will come out of this. Morsi has already been forced to say, that's not what I meant. He's basically dismantled most of the decree. As I say, it's a bad moment right now, but hopefully it will get better.
So, comparable to the U.S. pivoting to Asia, do you think in the Middle East there's a pivot away from reliance on the United States? And more self-reliance? In some sense, the problems are the problems to be worked out, resolved by us. The United States has not shown itself to be a force that brings cooperation and success, and its efforts to ward against violence and terror have only brought more of the same. It's hard to trust, not trust, but it's hard to be moved and find inspiration in the United States.
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think there has been, not just in the Arab world, but elsewhere as well, there's a really unhealthy preoccupation with the United States, for which the United States is also responsible. But one of the consequences of autocratic rule in the Arab world, in Egypt certainly, in Tunisia and elsewhere, was you had these tyrants who had their own, Yemen is another example, their own special relationship with the United States. And so that increased resentment against the United States, because the US was then seen as propping up this hated figure. And so it made the United States incredibly central to everybody's destiny in a really bad way. And then, of course, Americans were always frustrated because they said, we give all this money to all these countries and they still hate us anyway. Pakistan is another really, I think, kind of pathological example of this, a country which is completely preoccupied with the United States. Whatever bad things happen, it's the United States. You know, if the weather is bad, it's the CIA did it to us. So I hope that one of the consequences of people gaining self-government is that the United States will become less central to their lives, because people will feel like the contest is among us. The United States didn't cause it, the Arab Spring. It didn't prevent it. It can be helpful. It cannot solve the profound problems that people face. And so if the United States could become a more distant but mostly benevolent figure, that would be great. I don't think that can happen unless and until the Israel-Palestine problem is resolved. I mean, this is the one thing that ensures that the United States is seen as a bad actor in this part of the world, because the resentment, obviously, against Israel is profound. The feeling that Israel would not be able to behave the way it behaves without steadfast United States support means the United States is, in effect, a kind of accomplice to the crime that is Israel. That that ain't going to change unless and until this problem is resolved, and it's not going to be resolved anytime soon.
But if I recall, when Obama ran in 2008, he was, more open-minded about what needed to be done in Israel, and backed off it almost immediately. And by now, nowhere near backed off it so far. It's hard to identify how far back he is.
He really tried. He concluded several things early on. One is, every other president has waited till his last year in office. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to grasp the nettle now. And so, A, I got to take this seriously. B, I must get Israel to engage in, to accept the need to create confidence among the Palestinians, at least minimal confidence, by doing the one thing the Palestinians say is a sine qua non, which is the settlement freeze. Now, since then, in the aftermath, there's been all sorts of criticism of Obama for making this the sine qua non. But that's what he heard from the Palestinians. And so maybe there was some different way of going about it. I don't see what it was. Now, in retrospect, was it doomed from the start because Netanyahu was never going to either accept the settlement freeze or, more importantly, come to the kind of final status issues? Yes, it probably was. What then should Obama have done? I suppose the prudent thing would be nothing. But you can't do nothing in a situation like this. The anger and the violence is too great. So he tried. He failed. One of the conclusions he drew from the failure was that the Israelis don't trust me. And if the Israelis don't trust me, I can't get them to make compromises. Now, why do the Israelis not trust him? He didn't visit. They felt, I know this will come as this comes as a shock to audiences here, because everybody here thinks that Obama has been wildly pro-Israel. But from the point of view of the Israelis, he was too quick to criticize Israel and not equivalently, or rather he created a kind of moral equivalence between Israel and Palestine. So there was, at the time, a deep sense in Israel that we can't trust this guy with our security, no matter what Obama said and did. That is no longer true. Obama's absolutely resolute support for Israel in this second, most recent war in Gaza has changed the way he's viewed in Israel. He now has a lot of credit and legitimacy in Israel. But it won't do him any good. It won't do him any good because next month, Netanyahu's going to be reelected. He is going to have a more conservative government than he does now because Ehud Barak, the defense minister, is leaving. And so Israel is going to be even less inclined to compromise than before. And also the whole dynamic has changed because now Gaza and Hamas has become central to this process as opposed to the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. So nothing good there.
So that's your view of the prospects?
Zippo. I mean,
you want to put that in a somewhat less optimistic way?
I mean, I have said in one of my recent columns that, he should find a way of re-engaging. But I don't see any willingness on Netanyahu's part, and not a whole lot of willingness from what I know of the Israeli public, on the Israeli public's part, to engage in a serious way with Abbas and the Palestinians.
So you used the term engagement several times.
Oh, yeah.
And maybe you'd like to expand on what that is.
It is, after all, the title of...
Well, we can't let that bother us. But the thought is, that it sounds like the most the president can do is develop a methodology, a temperament, a way of setting and responding and doing foreign policy, and that engagement is a way of characterizing that way of doing.
It's an interesting point as to whether engagement is the word for a way of behaving or an outcome, whether it's
Right.
a process thing or a product. And I think it's both. So the way this came up, it was really interesting. It was very telling. So Obama's having a debate with Hillary Clinton in late 2007. And the moderator says, would you be willing to meet with all of America's worst enemies, Iran and Venezuela and so forth, without preconditions? And Hillary Clinton says, no, I wouldn't. And Obama says, I would. Now, they weren't expecting the question. The difference between them was actually quite small. But as one of Obama's advisors said to me afterwards, he found it orienting. Because he thought, yes, that's the kind of person I am. And that's how presidents make policies. It's not like me, reading a lot of stuff and coming to a conclusion. They do that too, of course. But there's also the sense of, how does it fit with me? How does it fit with my temperament? And so the idea of engagement, which is in effect to have a bias for speaking to everybody, and not just speaking to, but having diplomatic contacts of whatever kind to anybody, that's how Obama thinks about himself. Obama is someone who throughout his career has brought people who are warring with each other together. He is a kind of human convener and finder of common ground. So he thought, this is who I am. Now, it's a substantive view in the sense that it is different, was the opposite of George Bush's view that there are good countries and evil countries. And the United States is a good country which will have no truck with evil countries. That's a substantive view, and it's certainly in the sense that he gave this famous speech where he talked about the axis of evil, and he then went and had a war against one of the members of the axis. So Obama says, wrong. America can get things in its own interest by not speaking that language, that moralistic language, but by finding what is in the mutual interest of even our worst adversary and us. The famous example of this was Iran. So from the beginning, he would refer to Iran as the Islamic Republic of Iran. That is, he talked about Iran the way Iranians talk about Iran. He sent a Nowruz message his first year. And in general said, I want to find a way of solving this problem, as opposed to simply shaking a stick at Iran. Well, it failed, because the Iranians actually would rather have pursued their nuclear program than get whatever it is they thought Obama was offering. So that was a failure of engagement, but not altogether. Because one of the purposes of engagement was, if you need to get other countries on your side to build a coalition in order to accomplish something, including against a mutual adversary, it is essential that you first show that you are going to make any effort you can to avoid that confrontation. And so Iran has been a kind of limited success of Obama's, limited in the sense that Iran is still pursuing a nuclear program, therefore not a success. Some kind of success in the sense that Obama has succeeded in assembling a coalition, including Russia and China, to impose very tough sanctions on the Iranians and to really make them reconsider whether or not the pursuit of nuclear weapons is worth the price they're going to pay. Alas, so far, the answer is yes, it is worth the price they're going to pay. In other cases, Russia, for example, Obama inherited a very bad relationship between the U.S. and Russia because Russia had just invaded Georgia in 2008, and that really damaged relations, as it should have. It was a gross act of aggression on Russia's part. So Obama said, I'm going to rebuild that, which he did. He did. I would say for the first 2 years of his administration, he got a lot from Russia. He got this arms treaty. He got the Russians to allow the U.S. to use Russian territory to transship equipment to Afghanistan. He got Russian acquiescence on the sanctions against Iran. So it was good until it wasn't. And then basically when Putin was reelected as president, he decided that his own interests were to have bad relations with the U.S. And so it came to an end. So I would say the overall grade on engagement is really mixed. But it is very much in Obama's nature to believe in this. So while I think he has been chastened about engagement, and discovered that countries have interests that are sometimes not only different from but antithetical to the U.S., and sometimes it is in their interest to pose themselves against the U.S. So they want disengagement or anti-engagement. Nevertheless, I think probably he'll keep trying because that's the way he sees the world.
Well, I just can't help but point out that Obama's disposition, his DNA to engage, is something which didn't seem to work out domestically either.
No, it's a very good point that, and I've said this occasionally to administration officials, that he's tried to engage with Republicans, and they proved to be more intransigent than the Iranians.
Right.
So yeah, he's learned the same lesson, which is some people just don't want to be brought to the table.
My question is, next month we'll have the State of the Union address, which is on 23rd of January. What do you think the main strategy of Obama in that State of the Union address? Will it be more engagement, or will it be less engagement, or reserved engagement, or will it be more of a concentration of domestic issues rather than foreign policy? I say this because the state of the economy of the United States and the relationship with China basically is based on economic imbalance. Thank you very much.
Well, the first thing is what he says will depend enormously on the negotiations going on right now over avoiding the so-called fiscal cliff. And so when he gives this speech in late January, he will either be saying, thanks to the spirit of compromise and the commitment to America's future, we have laid the foundation for future prosperity. Or he will say, I did everything I could to offer common ground to the Republicans. They slapped away my hand, and I appeal to you, the American people, to support the economic agenda that I will now pursue despite Republican intransigence. So one way or another, the focus is going to be on domestic policy. This is the United States. In the United States, domestic policy almost always is more important than foreign policy. And so it is only at moments of high global tension, as in the aftermath of 9/11 and the Iraq War, where foreign policy predominated. For example, if you look at, in fact, with my students today, we were reading Bush's second inaugural in 2005. And that was quite unusual. It was all about his idea of democracy promotion and his new global agenda, because it was a moment of supreme foreign policy importance, and at that time the economy hadn't yet fallen apart. So whatever he says is mostly going to be about domestic policy. When he talks about foreign policy, what he will focus on, I would guess, is I have brought the war in Iraq to an end. I am in the process of bringing the war in Afghanistan to an end. I have profoundly eroded the danger of al-Qaeda. So these are, in effect, you might say, kind of negative achievements. And I think they will speak to the deep discomfort and, in some cases, antipathy that Americans right now are feeling about foreign policy and maybe about the world. It is not a hopeful moment at all. Obama will probably then want to talk, we'll talk about a couple of things. He'll talk about the Arab Spring because it is a possible source of hope, even though there's not a whole lot he'll be doing. He'll just want to raise this as people are seeking democracy everywhere. And he'll talk about Asia, because that's the future. That's the new thing that he's doing. So he'll talk a lot about how the United States is forging and thickening bonds with countries of East Asia, with Indonesia and the Philippines and Thailand and Vietnam. And he'll be very careful to make it clear that it is not against China. So he'll say nice things about China. But if I had to guess, I would say it's going to be 80% domestic policy and 20% foreign policy.
Just a quick minor question and a comment. How many employees does the American, how many thousands of employees does the American embassy have in Pakistan? That's the first question there. The comment is the reason for change with the American foreign policy. We know that in the past with Bush, when he was in office, that even the Europeans, there was an opinion poll, the Europeans saw America a greater threat than Iran. So the issue is how America is being seen, not the change of the policy. I mean, if America wasn't seen as bad on the stage, then all the killings would have you'd have continued with the same foreign policy, which is exactly the same foreign policy in Afghanistan. Nothing's really changed there. In Pakistan, with the drone attacks there, with Iraq, millions of people have died over there. So really, the real fact there is that there hasn't been really a major change in the foreign policy. The goals have been exactly the same there. It is American interest. It's just that you try to paint a different picture, slightly different picture, but with the same goals there. What really has changed since the 1900s is that in the past, you could easily occupy a country, but you couldn't get away with killing millions. But now, you can kill millions, but it's very difficult to occupy countries such as Afghanistan.
So let me stop you. I guess I would say a few things. One is there are fewer unidentified American employees at the Pakistan embassy than there used to be. And so all those guys who had a shadowy connection with the CIA, I don't know about all those, a lot of them are gone. However, that will not make, I think, basically until the United States just leaves Pakistan almost altogether, that will not, only then will it diminish the Pakistani unhealthy obsession with the role of the United States. As for the claim that nothing has changed, I guess part of the point of my first answer was a lot less has changed than people thought. I think you're wrong in thinking that occupation is the American wave of the future. I think the United States learned an extremely painful and expensive and bloody lesson over the course of the last decade. And we will not see occupations again, and we will not see these large-scale wars again. Obama inherited them. He didn't start either. And he would not, obviously, have fought the war in Iraq, which he opposed when he was a state senator in Illinois. So I think it's a little bit unfair to say that he's indistinguishable from Bush. What is true, though, is that he got his own lesson, I think, in Afghanistan. And so in Afghanistan, he thought, I think what he really thought was his options were terrible. He hated all of his options. Everything looked bad to him. But he chose to go with what his generals said, which was to have a big increase of 30,000 troops, a little more than 30,000 troops in Afghanistan, as well as his big civilian side as well, to use this so-called counterinsurgency policy. He would not say, his team would not say, it has failed. And we can't quite know yet whether it has failed on American terms, which is to say whether Afghanistan will emerge as a more or less stable, more or less self-sufficient country, not beset by the Taliban. What sure is true is that the hopes that the United States could bring big changes to Afghanistan and could bring big changes to its relationship with Pakistan have failed. Certainly America's relationship with Pakistan is dreadful. and its ability to create a better government in Afghanistan has produced very little. So that is, we'll see, that could prove to be Obama's great mistake. That is the ordering of this surge, this counterinsurgency program in Afghanistan.
I've got a question about Syria, but before I ask that, I just would like to highlight, I think you're being extremely insensitive about the situation in Pakistan. I mean, you mentioned correctly the fact that Obama, this escalation of drones, and of course with the Raymond Davis fiasco, I mean, you cannot underestimate the impact that it's had on many thousands of families, these, you know, unlicensed killings. I mean, you could imagine standing in the street wondering, is that drone, is it going to hit me? Is it going to hit my family? Is it going to hit my neighbor? You know, the psychological impact of those drones is quite frightening, and I don't think it should be underplayed, you know, in a world which is trying to be a bit more sensitive to the rule of law. My question about Syria is the cynic in me, and I would say that my reading of a lot in the Muslim world is that there's a lot of support for this, is that Obama has neglected the killings of the Syrian people by Bashar Assad when it comes to fighter attacks and cluster bombs, but now with the specter of the insurgency seeming on the brink possibly of ousting him, with an Islamic flavor, I might add, you know, all of a sudden the specter of chemical weapons sort of is risen. And you know, what are your views in terms of the next steps of what's happening in Syria?
First, I would dispute what you say about Pakistan. At least I don't know that it is so. What I do know is that when public opinion polls are taken, the rage against the drones is much greater in those parts of Pakistan where the drones don't go than it is in the frontier area where they do go. Second, there is a raging dispute about the number of innocent civilians who have been killed. The number could be in the hundreds. It could be significantly smaller. It's not clear, but it is by no means certain that it is in the thousands or anything like that. So, I mean, on balance, I think...
I just mentioned thousands of families affected.
Oh, well, that must be so. That must be so. But I think it's I don't think it's nearly as open and shut a case as that. On Syria, I think you're right in the sense that how is it that the use of chemical weapons is unspeakable, whereas the use of every other kind of instrument of violence, though terrible, would not provoke American action? That seems kind of ugly to me. I think saying that the U.S. has suddenly raised this because they fear an Islamist-flavored rule, I would question on two counts. One is that Obama started drawing this line several months ago before the concern with the increasing role of extremists was present. Second, the word Islamist doesn't really capture the problem. That is to say, Obama has fully come to terms, so far as I can tell, far more than secular people in the Arab world have, with the idea that democracy in the Arab world means, to some extent, Islamist rule. He has not hesitated to embrace President Morsi, and did from the outset, though others would have wished he didn't. The problem in Syria that the administration foresees is not Islamist rule. It goes without saying it will be Islamist. It goes without saying the rule in Libya will be Islamist. That's different from extremists who would be a catastrophe for Syria, leave aside the United States. That's a legitimate concern. Now, is that a good enough reason for the U.S. to have declined to arm anybody in Syria. I don't think so. I think that was a mistake on Obama's part. But I recognize that someone who is as acutely aware of the unintended consequences of your actions as Obama is, and rightly so, is going to err more than I would wish on the side of not acting. So that would be his rationale.
I'm interested, actually, especially something that you mentioned towards the State of the Union address that he's about to give next year, and talking about how the fiscal cliff, and he may blame that on domestic politics and especially some of the divisions between Democrats and Republicans and things like that. And I'm just wondering why, and this is not necessarily a criticism of yourself, but a general message, why is American foreign policy always seen as an individual kind of concept? So this is Bush's foreign policy or Obama's foreign policy. But the domestic policy is always seen as a conflict between the Democrats and the Republicans and kind of a balance in Congress and things like that.
What an interesting question. I don't know, I never thought about that before. I suppose the answer is that the Constitution leaves the conduct of foreign policy up to a president to a pretty great degree. And because the conduct of foreign policy does not necessarily involve appropriating funds, so the president has a much more central and individual role in foreign policy than he does in domestic policy. Also, electoral politics are carried out on domestic issues, not foreign policy issues. So in other words, the whole party is running based on its collective view of domestic policy, whereas it's the president much more who's going to be running on foreign policy. I guess that's the answer. It's an interesting question.
You've been talking about how you don't think there'll be these sort of occupations in America's future, and yet the fields for intervention seem to be multiplying with Libya and now in Syria. Where do you see the future of this going for American foreign policy, especially in terms of the concept of responsibility to protect, and is America still going to be the leader in intervention, or will this pass on to other countries?
Well, okay, so you can think about this word intervention in a couple different senses. You can think about it in the humanitarian sense that you raised, and then you can think about it in the much more national security sense of the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan as being interventions. On the humanitarian side, it's, I think, pretty clear that only in really rare conjunctions of circumstances will the United States and other actors, which mostly means the West, though it need not and should not, choose to intervene for humanitarian purposes. Now, there are a couple consequences of that. One is that there may be more interventions that are regional as opposed to global. So, for example, in West Africa, the organization ECOWAS, which is the, in effect, sub-regional organization of West Africa, has on several occasions intervened for humanitarian purposes, going back as far as Sierra Leone in 1999. One can imagine that happening, and that's actually a healthy thing, not an unhealthy thing, though I think there are very few other such groupings that are capable of doing that. Obama intervened very reluctantly in Libya, and of course he hasn't intervened in Syria, where the humanitarian argument is much more powerful than it was in Libya. Right? There's 40,000 people have died. Nobody can question the humanitarian argument for intervention in Syria. But nevertheless, Obama hasn't done it because he feels that the consequences would be worse than the good that it would bring. And that calculation will come all too often, I fear. You know, people always say, we can't let the next Rwanda happen. Well, the next thing that happens won't look like Rwanda. It'll look like something else. And people will find a reason not to do it. And the gentleman over there had said that America seems all too insistent on behaving according to national interest. Well, it does. and so do most states. And America probably makes more noise about acting not according to national interest, but according to values than most other countries do. And maybe is a little bit more willing to act in those ways, but not a lot. But then there's all the other kinds of interventions, which might be called humanitarian, but often they're much more for strategic purposes. And I think when I say that I don't think there'll be wars like this, and I don't think there'll be occupations like this, I think what there will be is small-scale things involving American special forces and drones and all sorts of remote control instruments which will allow America to leverage its power abroad without making the mistake of imposing itself on and occupying another country, because I think the U.S. has, as I say, learned a painful lesson on that one.
This question is not very interesting, but it's very
I'm sure you're selling yourself short.
No, but it's very practical. It's about the Middle East concerning Palestine and the Israeli conflict. Many people in Israel, I know, oppose Netanyahu. And although I believe he'll be re-elected, but they're very unhappy about the choice of him being prime minister again. And they more or less rely on the United States forcing the government to stop the settlements.
Yeah.
And by stopping is using different means which will hurt Netanyahu and even the state of Israel, but will force him to act and stop the settlements. Your reaction?
Yeah, I don't think there are enough of those people.
Yes, there are. Yes, there are.
Well,
yes, there are.
Okay, I hope you're right. My impression, and this is totally as an outsider, so I just speak secondhand, is that there is a lot of unhappiness with Netanyahu, and especially because there are a lot of people in Israel who think it is a bad idea to make the United States your enemy. And that's probably the single most unpopular thing that Netanyahu has done. But it's not nearly unpopular enough so that an alternative candidate like Ehud Olmert or Tzipi Livni could run on the basis of, I will cure that problem, and actually come anywhere close to winning a majority of votes. I think people they think he's been way too rash on Iran, and they're happy that he pulled back in part because of the United States. But even though my sense on the question of settlements and Middle East peace is that while the majority of Israelis continue to say there must be a two-state settlement, what they're saying under their breath is, but not now. Some other day, I hope we can. Right now, we can't. And so Netanyahu's stubbornness on those issues will not cost him with a big segment of the Israeli public, is my sense.
So my question relates to one of the foreign policy issues that were intensely discussed over the past election campaign, which is the Benghazi incident and how that had a consequence for the Obama administration in terms of its reliability, as well as the comments that came after David Petraeus' resignation. So would you say that incident has significant impact in one, popular perception of the administration's reliability when it comes to foreign policy, and the second, engagement? As you said, the government's openness could be interpreted as one of, say, the results or the consequences of the incident.
I think you phrased it the right way, which is, did Benghazi have an effect on the kind of American public view of the reliability or honesty of Obama and his team? Yes. Should it have? No. So I think of this as being almost wholly manufactured. The thing that Susan Rice said when she spoke on all these TV talk shows, which is that it was not a terrorist event. It was provoked by this movie. Was wrong, but not wildly wrong, and was an absolutely accurate reflection of what she had been told. But even if it was wronger than that, in the great scheme of things, so what? I mean, I don't think there's any reasonable claim that there was a cover-up. I think the idea that this horrible thing that happened must be a sign of some deep-seated failure on the part of the administration is based on the delusion that somehow you can have diplomatic representation in the most dangerous places in the world, diplomatic representation that actually tries to do what diplomats do, and yet somehow do it without danger to the diplomats. You can't. You can't. What happened was a terrible thing, and it certainly was avoidable in retrospect. But just statistically, it's almost inevitable that something like that would happen. So I think it should have been viewed as a tragedy and not as a scandal.
Well, and I'm very sorry, but on that note, that uplifting note, we'll have to call the formal part of this evening to an end, but there is a reception outside that begins immediately, during which time we'll be free to continue in an informal way your discussions with one another and with Jim. Thank you all very much for coming. And thank you to Jim.